9 college friends set out for a desert lake in 1994 and vanished without a trace. Their van, their belongings, even their laughter seemed to be swallowed whole by Lake Drywell. For 31 years, families searched, investigators speculated, and rumors twisted into legend. Then, during one of the worst droughts in Nevada history, the water receded and the desert finally gave something back. A rust-red van half buried in the mud. Inside, fragments of lives lost, and chilling signs that not everyone had died there. Who was driving that night? And what happened to the 5 who were never found? Don't look away. Like, subscribe, and join us as we unravel the mystery the desert tried to keep forever. 9 college friends vanished in 1994. 31 years later, a drought exposed their van in a desert reservoir. It was May 21, 1994. Sierra State College had just wrapped its spring semester, and campus sidewalks were littered with moving boxes, half-empty soda cups, and the echoes of another year gone. For most students, it meant heading home. For 9 friends, though, it meant one last adventure before scattering for the summer. They called themselves the Circle, not because of any secret, but because they always sat in a circle in the campus quad. They were inseparable. Mark, the van's driver, a mechanical engineering sophomore. Julie, his girlfriend, who carried a camera everywhere. Eric, a quiet kid with cassette tapes stacked in his backpack. Leah, who'd been accepted to a summer internship in Denver. Brian and Scott, the comic relief, roommates who never stopped bickering. Angela, the planner, who brought maps and a first aid kit. Tommy, a freshman but already part of the group. And Rachel, who scribbled poetry in a leather journal she carried everywhere. They packed into a borrowed 1983 Dodge Ram van. Red paint, roof rack, 2 sliding windows stuck halfway open. The van belonged to Mark's older brother, a landscaper who'd reluctantly loaned it out. It smelled like gasoline and grass clippings, but it was freedom on wheels. Their plan was simple. Drive 2 hours south into the Nevada desert, spend a weekend at Lake Drywell, a man-made reservoir tucked between dusty cliffs, and return by Sunday evening. They wanted to swim, camp, and watch the stars in a place where the horizon seemed endless. Parents waved them off in front of the dorms. Angela's mom told her not to forget sunscreen. Rachel's father handed her $20 for gas or emergencies. Julie snapped a photo of the group beside the van, squinting in the late morning sun, holding up soda cans like a toast. It would later be the last known photograph of all 9 together. They hit the road with windows down and music blaring. Eric fed tapes into the deck. Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alanis Morissette, while Brian beat on the van's dashboard like a drum. Desert heat pressed against them, but spirits were high. At a rest stop an hour south, Julie snapped another photo. The van parked against a backdrop of cracked earth and endless sky. Strangers remembered seeing them laughing, sharing chips, and joking about the heat. Some details would only seem strange in hindsight. Leah, usually meticulous, left her internship paperwork behind in her dorm room. Rachel scribbled a line in her journal that afternoon, "The desert keeps what it swallows." And Mark told a cashier at the gas station when asked where they were headed, "Just down to Drywell, if we ever make it back." Everyone laughed. By late afternoon, they reached Lake Drywell. The reservoir shimmered like glass beneath the sun. Sparse juniper trees clung to the cliffs, and the air smelled of hot stone and dust. Fishermen sat on folding chairs by the shoreline, while a handful of families splashed near the boat ramp. The friends parked in a gravel lot above the waterline. They unloaded sleeping bags, coolers, and a bag of marshmallows. Julie ran ahead with her camera, capturing the moment the desert opened up before them. Witnesses would later recall seeing the red van parked near the ramp, 9 young people laughing, and a cassette player blasting across the water. By nightfall, they had vanished into the desert silence. That evening, a ranger driving the perimeter saw a campfire glowing faintly on the eastern ridge. He assumed it belonged to hikers and made a note in his log. Unofficial campsite, East Drywell, 9:20 p.m. At 10:47 p.m., a trucker on the highway reported seeing a red van with its headlights weaving off-road, heading toward the southern edge of the reservoir. He thought they looked lost, maybe kids looking for a better spot. Those were the final sightings. The next morning, families expected phone calls. By Sunday night, panic set in. By Monday, campus friends noticed 9 empty dorm rooms. By Tuesday, police were combing the desert roads. But when investigators arrived at Lake Drywell, the van was gone. The fire pit was cold ash. The shoreline was empty. And the desert, as Rachel had written, had swallowed them whole. That was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Nevada for 31 years, until a drought finally exposed the reservoir's secret. At first, police treated it like a routine missing persons report. 9 students, end of semester, a lake weekend gone long. Deputies from Drywell County assumed they'd return by midweek with sunburns and hangovers. But by Thursday, with no calls, no classes attended, and parents flooding the sheriff's office with questions, the tone shifted. Something was wrong. On May 27, 1994, deputies traced their route. The van's description was broadcast: a red Dodge Ram with Nevada plates 4JX532. Flyers papered truck stops, diners, and gas stations across the interstate. A search team scoured Lake Drywell. Boats dragged sonar across the reservoir surface. Divers dropped into the water and helicopters circled above. Rangers patrolled the cliffs where the fire pit had been reported. For 2 weeks, volunteers trudged through the desert scrub, pushing against 100-degree heat. They found scattered beer bottles, tire marks that led nowhere, and ash from what could have been a campfire. But the van, the heart of the search, was gone. Witness statements confused investigators. The ranger swore he saw a fire glowing on the ridge at 9:20 p.m. A trucker claimed he saw their van near the reservoir's southern edge an hour later. A fisherman insisted he heard a woman screaming around midnight, though others dismissed it as coyotes. Every account pointed in a different direction, and none could be confirmed. Families pushed back against the idea of a runaway. Angela's mother insisted her daughter had left her asthma inhaler at home. She would never, ever go far without it. Leah's internship supervisor confirmed she was due in Denver the following week. Papers signed, stipend already issued. Rachel's father clutched her journal, retrieved from her dorm, where the last entry read, "The desert keeps what it swallows." The sheriff told reporters, "We're not looking at a runaway. We're looking at 9 students who vanished without leaving tracks." Whispers spread fast across the county. Some claimed cartel traffickers used the reservoir roads at night, and maybe the students had stumbled into something. Others recalled Red Jack, a drifter who haunted the desert highways and was suspected in 2 disappearances in '92. He was questioned but released for lack of evidence. And then there was the lake itself. Old-timers swore that when Drywell Reservoir was built, the government never cleared the canyon fully. They said entire foundations, even a church steeple, were still down there. Maybe the van had sunk where no sonar could reach. By summer's end, the official search tapered off. State troopers widened the net, checking abandoned mines, interviewing hitchhikers, chasing down dozens of dead-end tips. In July, a hiker turned in a shoe he found in the desert scrub. The sole matched a brand Rachel was known to wear. Forensics, though, couldn't prove it belonged to her. In August, fishermen swore they saw a red object glinting beneath the waterline. Divers searched for 2 days, finding nothing but rusted metal from a drowned boat ramp. The case stalled. When the fall semester opened, 9 empty beds on campus were stark reminders. Dorm mates taped flyers to bulletin boards. Smiling faces, last seen dates. Professors left their names on class rosters for weeks, as though expecting them to walk back in. The circle, once inseparable, was now a cautionary tale whispered in campus halls. By 1996, the investigation was considered inactive. The files filled 3 boxes in the sheriff's evidence room. Maps marked with red X's, rolls of undeveloped film, transcribed interviews, and dozens of false leads. Families clung to hope, gathering every May at the reservoir for candlelight vigils. But the water never gave anything back. For 31 years, the desert held its silence. Until the drought came, and Lake Drywell began to drop. Rumors spread faster than the heat shimmer on the desert highway, and for years they kept the story alive when the case itself had gone cold. Each theory had its believers, and each one left the families torn between dread and desperate hope. Some swore it was the cartel. The 1990s had brought drug routes snaking across the Nevada desert, and the van might have wandered onto a road where it shouldn't have been. 9 kids could have stumbled onto a deal or a stash, and been silenced before they ever made it back to camp. It was the kind of theory the sheriff's office never confirmed but never dismissed either. Others pointed fingers at Red Jack, a drifter known to hang around truck stops along Interstate 80. He had a violent record, tied to fights and a stabbing in '92. Witnesses claimed he'd been seen near Drywell that very weekend. When deputies picked him up, he denied everything, but his reputation made the families wonder. To this day, locals say he muttered about kids in the lake when he was drunk. But there was never enough to charge him, and eventually he disappeared himself, vanishing into the same desert that had taken the 9. There were darker whispers too, legends tied to the reservoir itself. Lake Drywell had been built over an old mining canyon. People claimed when the water was low, you could still see the top of a steeple or the outlines of forgotten foundations below. Fishermen told stories of snagging their lines on fence posts buried underwater. If a van had gone over the edge, maybe it had been swallowed by the canyon floor, hidden where no sonar beam could reach. The image haunted the parents, their children sealed in a van beneath black water, waiting. Some theorists believed the 9 had never left the shore. They pointed to the ranger's note about a campfire on the eastern ridge. Maybe they'd been attacked there, ambushed by someone who knew the back trails, someone who knew how to erase tracks in desert sand. Search teams had found scraps of ash and bottle glass, but no bodies, no evidence of violence. Still, for some families, it was easier to imagine their children taken by a predator than drowned nameless in the reservoir. The most haunting theory came from the trucker's sighting. He swore he saw their van's headlights weaving near the southern edge of the lake late that night. If he was right, they might have been lost, disoriented in the dark, trying to find a road back to the highway. The lake's drop-offs were steep and unmarked. One wrong turn, and the van could have plunged silently into the water. The driver's seatbelt buckled, the doors locked, 9 souls trapped before anyone knew they were missing. By the late 1990s, the case had become folklore. Students whispered it in dorm halls. Families lit candles each May. Strangers came to Lake Drywell just to stand at the shoreline and wonder, did the desert swallow them whole, or did someone help cover the tracks? For 31 years, all anyone had were theories, half-remembered sightings, and rumors traded in truck stops. The truth waited, buried in the water, until the drought finally pulled the reservoir back and showed what it had been hiding all along. The drought began as a whisper, the kind of slow disaster people in Nevada had seen before. Reservoirs shrank, riverbeds cracked, and farmers shook their heads at the sky, waiting for rains that never came. By the spring of 2025, Lake Drywell, once a man-made oasis in the desert, had fallen to its lowest level since it was first filled in the 1960s. Waterlines stained the cliffs like faded rings on a bathtub, marking each year the desert had taken more than it had given back. Boats sat stranded on mudflats, their trailers sun-bleached and skeletal. The smell of dried algae hung thick in the heat, and fishermen found themselves casting into shallow pools instead of open water. It was late May, 31 years to the month since 9 college friends had vanished on these shores, when the reservoir yielded its secret. 2 men from a nearby town, weekend fishermen who still tried their luck in the shrinking shallows, had parked their pickup at the southern boat ramp. They walked the cracked earth with poles slung over their shoulders, their boots crunching through dried reeds. At first it was just a glint, a flash of metal half buried in the mud. They thought it was an old signpost or a bit of scrap. But as they stepped closer, the shape grew clearer, a roof line rusted and blistered, peeking out of the clay like a sunken tomb. The driver's side corner was the first to emerge, a curve of steel coated in red-brown rust. The windshield was opaque with silt, a blind eye staring at the open sky. The men stood frozen, their laughter gone, the silence of the desert pressing around them. One reached out and touched the roof, and his fingers came back caked in mud. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't scrap metal. This was a vehicle long buried, now pulled back into daylight by the drought. They called the sheriff's office, voices unsteady, trying to describe what they had found. Within hours, deputies arrived, their SUVs kicking up dust. Yellow tape went up around the area, though the crowd was small. Just a handful of locals drawn by curiosity and the echo of an old mystery. Rangers from the State Water Authority confirmed what everyone already suspected. The reservoir had receded far enough to expose something that had been hidden since the mid-1990s. The sheriff stepped close, his boots sinking in the soft mud, and brushed his hand against the corroded paint. Underneath the rust, faint but visible, was a patch of red. They ran the license plate, still clinging to the bumper, though the numbers were bleached almost white. The digits came back like a ghost, 4JX532. A match to the Dodge Ram van reported missing in May of 1994. News spread faster than the desert wind. By sunset, local reporters were live at the scene, their cameras zoomed on the half-exposed van. They called it the find of the decade, the break in one of Nevada's most haunting unsolved cases. Families of the 9 students, scattered across the country now, received phone calls they had both prayed for and dreaded. After 31 years of silence, Lake Drywell had spoken. Recovery began the next morning. Heavy equipment rumbled across the dried reservoir floor, chains clanking, mud sucking at tires. Deputies and forensic teams in white suits worked carefully, unwilling to disturb whatever lay inside. The van was lodged deep, its front end angled downward, the rear barely visible above the cracked surface. It took hours of pumping and digging before the tow rig could haul it free. As the van broke from the mud, its roof peeled up like the shell of something long dead, water and silt spilling out in black streams. The crowd that gathered at the edge of the tape fell silent. What emerged was less a vehicle than a coffin of rust and bone. The windows had blown inward from years of pressure. Seats collapsed into skeletal frames, the steering wheel eaten away. But the outline was unmistakable. This was the van 9 friends had driven into the desert in 1994. Inside, forensic teams found the first grim evidence. Shreds of fabric clung to seat springs, faded denim, a strip of floral print. A cassette tape still sat in the dashboard deck, its label smudged but the word "mix" just visible in blue ink. In the glove compartment, a Sierra State College parking permit, spring 1994, crumbled at the edges but intact enough to read. Then came the bones. At first, just fragments. A femur, ribs tangled in wires. They bagged each piece carefully, labeling the finds under the pitiless sun. In the back seat area, they discovered more substantial remains, the curve of a skull still nestled against the frame. It would take weeks for the state lab to confirm identities, but everyone knew. After 3 decades of speculation, at least some of the 9 had been found. Yet even in discovery, mystery thickened. The driver's seatbelt was buckled, the strap brittle but unmistakably fastened. It suggested whoever sat there had been restrained at the moment the van sank. But no remains were found in the driver's seat. The passenger seat was empty as well, only springs and rust. In total, only partial remains of 4 individuals were recovered from the van. The others, 5 missing friends, were nowhere inside. Forensic divers combed the surrounding mud, probing with poles and scanners, but the drought had left only patches of stagnant water, too shallow to conceal much. Some suggested scavengers or shifting silt might have scattered the rest. Others whispered darker possibilities, that not everyone had gone into the water that night, that some had been taken elsewhere. As investigators pieced through the wreck, media descended. Headlines blared across the country. Vanished 94 students found at last. Lake gives up its dead. Drywell mystery resurfaces. The families, now older, gray where once they had been young parents, stood together at a press conference. Some wept openly, others stared ahead in silence, too numb for words. For years they had clung to fading photos, to the sound of young voices on old videotapes. Now, with the van exposed, grief came rushing back like the water that had once hidden it. The sheriff promised transparency. He spoke of closure, of finally bringing answers. But when pressed by reporters, why only 4? Why buckled seatbelts? Why here, why now? He admitted the truth. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. The van itself became a kind of shrine. People drove for hours to stand at the edge of the reservoir, to glimpse the rusted shell cordoned off under guard. Some brought flowers, leaving them in the cracked mud. Others brought cameras, documenting what felt like history clawed up from the desert floor. Forensic analysis stretched on for weeks. DNA confirmed 4 of the friends, Mark, Julie, Angela, and Eric. Their families received the calls with shaking voices, knowing at least a piece of truth had been returned. But 5 others, Leah, Brian, Scott, Tommy, and Rachel, remained missing. No trace of their remains was found in the van. Investigators studied every inch of the wreck. They noted the broken headlights, the dented grille, as if the van had struck something before sinking. Mud packed the undercarriage, filling the wheel wells, sealing the doors tight for decades. Strangely, the ignition was still in the on position, the keys rust-welded in place. One theory suggested the van had rolled into the water with the engine running, the weight pulling it down fast. Another suggested a deliberate plunge, headlights off, silence swallowing 9 young lives. Families struggled with the partial answers. At a vigil held that June, candles flickered against the desert night. Leah's mother clutched her daughter's senior portrait, her voice breaking as she asked how closure could exist when her child's body had not been found. Rachel's father read aloud the last words from her journal, "The desert keeps what it swallows." For many, the Drought's revelation felt like a cruel half-gift, offering proof of death without the peace of knowing how or why. Theories resurfaced with new fuel. Had the group been chased that night, run off the road by headlights that never appeared in reports? Had some escaped before the van sank, only to meet another fate? The seatbelt, buckled without a body, haunted investigators. Did it mean someone had been tied, restrained, left to drown? Or was it a trick of time, the belt snapping back after decades underwater? Even the cassette found in the dashboard sparked eerie speculation. Forensic teams cleaned it carefully, and though the tape was warped, fragments of sound could be heard. Muffled guitar chords, a voice laughing before the music cut off. Families clung to it as the last recorded trace of their children's joy, a moment frozen before the van's final descent. By midsummer, the van was towed from the site and transported under heavy guard to a state lab. Investigators promised more answers, but none came quickly. The drought deepened, shrinking Drywell further, and locals wondered what else the receding water might reveal. Old stories of buried structures, of forgotten graves, seemed less like folklore and more like possibility. For the families, the discovery changed everything and nothing. They had proof of death, but not of the full story. They had bones, but not all of them. They had a van, but not the reason it had ended up in the heart of the reservoir. Closure remained as elusive as ever, wrapped in 31 years of silence. At night, locals driving past Drywell swore they could see the outline of the van's resting place even after it had been removed, a dark patch in the clay where the desert had cradled its secret. And for every person who whispered relief that the case was closer to solved, another whispered unease, that 5 names still hung unanswered, 5 lives still unaccounted for. The drought had given up part of the truth, but part of it remained buried, waiting. The van was gone from Lake Drywell, hauled away on a flatbed under the cover of night. What remained was a scar in the mud where it had rested for 3 decades, a hollow imprint that drew visitors like a pilgrimage site. Even after deputies tore down the yellow tape, people came. Some left flowers, some left candles, others simply stood with hands on their hips, staring into the empty shape as if it might whisper the truth. For all the relief of finding something at last, the questions that hung in the desert air only grew heavier. The bones of 4 friends had been identified, but 5 others remained missing. Families clutched at the silence, trying to fill it with meaning. Where had Leah gone? Where was Rachel, whose journal had prophesied the desert's hunger? What about Brian, Scott, and Tommy, the boys who had made the circle laugh with their endless banter? They were not in the van. Their DNA wasn't among the fragments. And without them, no one could say the story was finished. The sheriff stood before cameras and repeated what he had said in private. "We don't have all the answers. We may never have them." His voice was tired, aged by decades of the same question echoing across every town hall, every vigil. He held up photographs of the recovered evidence. The rusted cassette, the fragments of clothing, the buckled seatbelt. Proof but not explanation. Artifacts without context. Detectives revisited the original witness statements. The ranger's note about a campfire. The trucker's sighting of headlights veering near the southern shore. The fisherman's report of a scream in the dark. None of them had been verified then, and none seemed clearer now. If the van had plunged into the reservoir that night, why had only some of the passengers been trapped inside? Did the others escape before the sinking? So where had they gone? The desert, after all, kept what it swallowed. Forensics suggested the van had entered the water at speed, nose first, which explained its downward angle in the mud. But the details twisted tighter around the mystery. The ignition had been on, the keys frozen in place. The driver's seatbelt had been fastened. And yet no driver's remains were found. Had someone jumped free in the final seconds? Had someone forced another to stay strapped in? Theories bloomed and withered in the heat, each one darker than the last. Families gathered for a joint memorial at Sierra State College that autumn. The campus had changed, new buildings, new faces. But in the courtyard where the 9 had once sat in their circle, hundreds came to remember them. Professors who had grown old spoke about their students as if they had only just walked out the door. Classmates, now middle-aged, told stories of laughter, of late-night study sessions, of plans that had never been fulfilled. The families held each other, united by grief and fractured by the lingering question of what really happened. Reporters tried to capture the moment, but their cameras could not show the ache of a mother who still set an empty place at her table every Thanksgiving. They could not capture the way a father's hand trembled as he lit a candle, his face lined with 3 decades of waiting. For some, the discovery had cemented what they had long feared. Their children were gone. For others, it reopened the wound, making the absence even sharper. Meanwhile, investigators dug into theories with renewed vigor. Some believed foul play had forced the van off the road. The idea of a chase resurfaced, headlights pressing from behind, the driver panicked, losing control. But there were no reports of another vehicle in the area that night. Others speculated about a staged accident, that someone had driven the van deliberately into the reservoir to hide evidence of a crime. But why leave 4 bodies inside and remove 5? And how had no one seen or heard the act in a place that, while remote, was not entirely deserted? Rumors of Red Jack, the drifter once suspected, returned to the surface. Old case files noted his mutterings about kids in the lake, his tendency to haunt the southern roads. But he had disappeared in the late 90s, and whatever secrets he held had gone with him. Some thought he might have forced some of the group into the van while taking others elsewhere. But the logistics stretched belief. 9 people, a single predator? Still, families could not shake the possibility. The reservoir itself became suspect in people's minds. Divers had always spoken of the canyon's depths, of old structures and twisted rebar left behind when the government filled it with water. The van might have struck debris, pinning doors shut. Perhaps some of the students had scrambled free in the seconds before it went under, only to drown in deeper water or vanish into caves that riddled the canyon walls. But after 31 years there were no remains, no proof. Only mud, only silence. The cassette recovered from the dashboard offered eerie fragments. Specialists coaxed sound from its warped tape, releasing snippets of laughter, a burst of music, someone singing off-key. For families it was bittersweet, a sliver of life preserved in static. For investigators, it was nothing more than noise, another reminder of what was lost in the water that night. As the drought deepened, Lake Drywell continued to shrink. Locals watched the shoreline retreat, exposing tree stumps, rusted cans, the bones of fish long dead. Each new discovery drew speculation. Could the missing 5 be buried elsewhere in the mud? Had scavengers scattered their remains across the desert? Or were they never in the water at all? Every dry week seemed to promise another revelation, and yet none came. The van was the only gift the drought had given. Families began to divide in their beliefs. Some accepted the simplest explanation. The van had gone into the reservoir with all 9 inside, and time had scattered what little was left. Others refused to believe their loved ones had died there at all. They clung to rumors of sightings in other states, unverified tips from strangers who swore they had seen someone who looked like Rachel, or like Leah in the years after 1994. Every tip ended in disappointment, but the hope never fully died. The sheriff, now gray and worn, admitted privately that the case had become a weight he could never set down. 31 years of theories, of vigils, of questions that had no answers. He knew the discovery of the van should have brought closure, but instead it had breathed life back into the mystery, ensuring it would never truly rest. He told a reporter off camera, "Sometimes the desert doesn't give back the truth. Sometimes it just gives back enough to keep you guessing." The final unanswered question haunted everyone. Who had been driving? The seatbelt buckled, the keys in the ignition. It was impossible to ignore. If Mark, the usual driver, had been in the seat, where were his remains? If not him, then who had taken the wheel that night, and why had they been absent from the wreckage? Some whispered about betrayal within the group, others about a stranger forcing them at gunpoint. Every possibility was both too simple and too far-fetched. In the end, the unanswered questions stretched longer than the list of things known. Why were only 4 inside? What happened to the other 5? Did they drown elsewhere? Did they escape, or were they taken? Who drove into the reservoir? Was it panic, accident, or design? And why had it taken 3 decades and the mercy of a drought for the truth to rise even this far? As autumn came, the families gathered one last time at the reservoir. They stood in the desert wind, candles flickering weakly against the night. Their voices rose together in prayer, in memory, in anger. They spoke the names of the 9, one by one, into the silence that had claimed them. For a moment, it felt as if the desert itself paused, listening. When the candles burned low, they placed them in the hollow where the van had rested, tiny lights in the shape of the vehicle's ghost. And as the flames trembled in the dark, the unanswered questions hung heavier than ever, suspended between earth and sky. The drought had pulled back the curtain, but only partway. What remained was a story without an ending, a mystery without resolution. The van had been found. The remains of 4 had been claimed. But 5 were still missing, 5 stories still unwritten. The families left in silence, the desert reclaiming the night. And those who lingered swore that when the wind swept across Lake Drywell's empty basin, it carried whispers, not words, not clear, but the sound of laughter on a cassette tape, the echo of headlights in the dark, the memory of 9 young friends whose journey had ended on a desert road with no answers. 31 years later, the questions remained, and perhaps they always would.